Chapter 24 of the Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. To beard the tiger in his den. Sure you can go, Jim. And what's more, I'd like to take the tramp with you, if it's agreeable to you. Jim Hasty, the guide, swallowed something in his throat when he heard Tad say these words, for he was plainly much affected. He had come in a hesitating way to ask as a favor that since the scouts were now settled for a few days in camp on the lake shore, could he be spared to make the run through the pine forests to where the well-remembered cabin of old Cale Martin stood, from which he had carried little Lena away after her father had positively refused to even hear of their marriage. "It's mighty kind of you to say that, and I feel it, I swan," he finally stammered, as he managed to thrust out his brown hand and take that of the boy which had been so impulsively offered to him. "Why," Tad went on heartily, "you know, Jim, I'm as much interested in this matter between you and Cale Martin as can be, and I'm just bound to see you through. I heard what one of those men told you about Cale going off to his cabin so's to try and keep away from temptation, while Jim Hasty was around the neighborhood. He'd sworn to pin your ears to a tree, and feared that he'd up and do it if he had a chance. Something better inside old Cale was a tugging away at his old hard heart, and Jim, you and I know what it is." The short guide nodded his head violently, while his eyes glittered. "Poor old Dad, he wants to see his little gal their worst kind. And it's just his consarned pride as keeps him from knuckling right down, and owning he were wrong. That's what I says in ther fust place. I jest knowed he dasn't raise a hand to hurt me, as he threatened, 'cause Lena keers for even ther little finger o' my hand, and she war the apple o' his eye. And shore, I feels as it's agoin' to be all right, if so be I kin only git a few words with ther old man face to face." "And you shall, if I can help you out, Jim," declared the boy with emphasis. "Perhaps some day I might even see the little Lena that all this fuss has been about. I'd sure like to, the worst kind. But about when do you think we'd better hike out across country for the Martin cabin, Jim?" "I'd like to start inside o' an hour," returned the other quickly, as his eye instinctively turned upwards toward the heavens, with the idea of gauging what the weather might have in store for the state of Maine during the next 24 hours. "I see you're afraid of a heavy snowfall. That would make the going and coming a hard job. Is that it, Jim?" "It shore is, Tad," replied the guide promptly. "You see, it's long past due. The woods is as dry as tinder, and we need a big fall of snow or rain ther worst kind. Do you think we mout get away by that time?" "I don't see why not," answered the young scoutmaster. "I'm feeling in apple pie condition this morning myself, and you're just wild to make the venture. So we'll call it a go in an hour, Jim. By that time breakfast will be done with, and the boys have their plans arranged for the day. Eli will take charge with Allan, and there ought to be no trouble. Both Bumpus and Giraffe are too tired after what they went through with the day before yesterday to want to wander. The game warden is well on his way with his 2 prisoners, and everything looks just fixed to carry out your little plan." "It does that," returned the other eagerly. "Seems like things happen just to suit me. I calls it Little Lena luck, for they nigh allers turn that-a-ways when I'm tryin' to please her. I worried a heap over them 2 critters, Si Kedge and Ed Harkness, thinkin' that while I mout convince Dad, they was apt to give me a lot of trouble. And see how they was carried off to jail to clear their field for me. Oh, somethin' tells me hit's goin' to be all right yit." "Is there anything we ought to take along with us, besides our guns and some grub, enough for several meals, because we won't have any time for hunting?" asked Tad. "Nothin' as I knows on. I'm makin' sure to carry their life preserver." And as he said these mysterious words, Jim pressed his hand against his breast, where in an inner pocket something undoubtedly snuggled unseen. But somehow Tad never once dreamed that the guide could refer to a pocket flask, because he happened to know Jim did not drink. However, Tad did not bother about trying to fathom Jim's little secret. He fancied that it would all be made plain shortly. Certainly when they happened upon the stern old man who was day after day cheating himself out of happiness by refusing to let bygones be bygones and accept things as they were. Of course, the balance of the Silver Fox Patrol showed great interest when they heard what was the plan. Thad could read a trace of disappointment on more faces than one when he announced that he meant to go alone with Jim. A larger detachment would do more harm than good, since Old Cale might be angry at having his solitude invaded by a party that Jim was piloting through the piney woods. And besides, Allen was needed to take charge of the camp while the leader was away. Step Hen had had his outing in the company of Thad himself. Bumpus and Giraffe were fairly saturated with adventure, and still feeling the effects of their experience, while Davy was needed in camp, and complaining of a lame foot besides. So, within the hour that had been set for the start, Thad and Jim left camp, with many hearty wishes for their success. "Be sure and tell us all about it when you get back," called Bumpus, for some of the boys scented a little romance back of Jim's queer actions, and knew more or less about his relations with the giant father of his little wife. "And look sharp for forest fires, because seems to me I smelled smoke in the air a little while ago," were the last words from Allen, who, being a Maine boy, knew what such a thing meant. Thad glanced sharply at Jim. "Do you imagine we'll stack up against anything like that, Jim?" he asked. "That's hard to say," replied the guide. "At this time of year, and with their woods as dry as they be, anything is possible, I'd say. I don't smell smoke right now, but then their wind mout have changed since Allen says he did." "Well, I hardly know whether I want to run up against a real woods fire or not," Thad declared. "Of course, I've always wanted to see what one looked like, because I've heard so much about them. We're on a new test now for the Silver Fox Patrol, being assistant fire wardens of the state of Maine, and as such none of us should wish a fire to occur. So I'll just forget all about it. If one happens to come along, I guess there's no harm in my looking at it." Jim laughed at this quaint philosophy. "I just reckons now, you'll be doing a heap more'n just looking at it," he took occasion to remark, with a sage shake of his head. Thad laughed outright. "I can guess what you mean, Jim," he remarked. "You think that about that time the fire will take to chasing after me, and I'll have all I want to do in skipping out. Well, let's forget about all that now, and talk of something else. For one thing, this is a splendid, crisp fall morning. I saw pretty good ice on the edge of the lake. And say, I'd like to be up here a month or two from now. I warrant you there's some mighty fine skating on that sheet of water." "That they be, sometimes," replied the other with a nod. "I've seen it just as slick as a big pane of glass for miles and miles. With their wind a-blowing great guns, I've just opened my coat, and been blown like a thistledown from one end to the other, in less time than you could think. My dad, which is long gone, once had an adventure with a pack of wolves on that same smooth ice, I can remember him a-tellin' about." "I'd like to hear it, Jim," said the scout eagerly. "Wall, I'm a poor hand at tellin' a story," the guide admitted. "Seems like he were a-skatin' home arter killin' a deer, and hed some o' ther meat on his back when ther wolves took arter him. They chased him right fast, and ther only way Dad he could escape ther fangs war by makin' a sharp turn every time they got too clost. Yer see, ther critters couldn't swerve fast enough, and slide a long ways on ther ice, 'cause it were so smooth. And in that way he kept goin' till he got nigh home, when some o' ther neighbors they kim out and knocked spots outen ther wolves." "Whew, I can just imagine it," declared Thad. "And I wager now it must have been some exciting while it lasted." Chatting in this way, they tramped on through the pine woods, heading in a direct line for the distant cabin of Cale Martin, whose wife had long since been dead, so that with little Lina also gone, the old woodsman had lived alone for more than a year, always nursing his grievance against Jim Hasty. When noon came, and they stopped a little while to refresh themselves with some of the food carried along in Thad's haversack, Jim announced that they must be more than halfway to their destination. Thad looked into the face of the guide frequently, wondering if Jim's heart was beginning to fail him the closer he drew to the implacable giant who had uttered such ferocious threats against his new son-in-law. But the only thing he did notice was a smile of supreme confidence whenever Jim happened to put up his hand to touch the breast of his coat, about the place where an inner pocket would be. And from this Thad understood that the other had the fullest confidence that the message he was bearing to Lina's father, The olive branch he meant to extend to Old Cale was sure to work as she had intended it should. It was about an hour and more, possibly 2, after the noon halt, that Thad saw Jim come to a stop and start to sniff the air suspiciously. "What is it, Jim?" he asked, though he could give a pretty good guess even before the woods pilot uttered a word. "I smell smoke, sure enough now," replied Jim. "Then the wind's changed, hasn't it?" inquired Thad, bristling up, as a vision of more or less excitement to vary the monotony of this rather dreary tramp through the piney forest flashed before his mind. "Hit sure hes, Thad. And I kinder guess afore a great while you might be havin' that wish of yourn come true; 'cause there's a fire somewhere not far away right now, which, with her change of wind, is liable to sweep down on us like a whirlwind. Mebbe so you be mout seen more'n you bargained fur, Thad." Chapter 24